Welcome to the Video Jungle Podcast. I am Artie Gold. This is Justin Andrews.
How's it going?
And Justin, did you let Roy out of his cage again?
Roy is allowed to be sitting next to us today. Excellent. And it's a real honor and a pleasure, Roy.
Hi.
Roy Power.
Glad to be here. I'm glad to be back.
One of our head editors and also director of probably one of our, if not our most successful short film.
He's the closest to a famous person I know. Because we're coming, the Oscars were last night.
Yes.
We don't know when this is going to air, but Roy, American Factory, hot take.
Yeah, American Factory won Best Documentary, and the directors of that are actually fans of Memory Video. Steve, one of the directors, said it's a wonderful little film. So
that means that Barack Obama might have watched it, right?
Exactly.
That's
like
fantastic.
Elton John might have watched the Loca County videos.
We joke a lot about that because Roy went on the film festival route and brought, Memory Video everywhere. But the fact of the matter is, part of the whole film festival thing is meeting people and, figuring out your place in this world. And you got to meet those producers plus a lot of them. And our guest this week is another person that you met, correct?
Yeah, EJ. I actually never met him. I've only met him online and on the phone and everything.
But
that's how you meet people these days.
Yeah, right.
That's it. That's all that matters.
But we've had both of our movies have played at a lot of the same festivals.
So let me ask you this, Roy, because I'm not going to date myself, but I've never done Tinder, and I've never done these dating services.
You're talking about actually dating yourself.
Maybe. Yes, I'm dating myself. But so how does this work? EJ McLeavey-Fisher calls you up and says, Roy, I like that sparkle in your eyes, and I want to learn more about your film. Like, how does this go down?
Well, it's the opposite way. I mean, I reached out to him because I love the sparkle in his eyes.
All right, great.
But basically, I think I first heard about the guy from the Montclair Film Festival, where I showed Memory Video, and I'd heard about the guy also showing, and I think I won the Audience Award there for Best Short Documentary. And then a few weeks later, when I got accepted into the Nantucket Film Festival, I noticed it was actually in the same screening block as Memory Video. So before the festival started, I watched a bunch of the movies online to kind of know ahead of time and reach out to whoever would be there. And the guy stuck with me the most, basically, because it was such a fun, well-made, tightly edited, funny documentary that I thought worked well with Memory Video because it didn't take itself too seriously. So I reached out to EJ kind of saying, hey, I love your movie. Will you be at Nantucket? And he wasn't, but the subject was Brian and his wife, and so I was able to kind of make those connections there.
And can you just tell us what the guy is about?
Right. So the guy is about Brian Donahue, who's he's been a stuntman since probably the 80s, and he's kind of pretty well known on David Letterman. He does a lot of stunt work for network TV shows and movies and a little bit of acting work on the side. And the documentary is kind of like a whole bunch of things about his life, his craft, kind of his personality than anything, and a sense of humor is my takeaway from it. And just kind of his enigmatic personality as he's getting beat up and throwing people off buildings and throwing himself off buildings and all that fun stuff.
So before we get to EJ's interview, what is it about EJ that you really admired and that you really liked about how he approached this film?
Well, I think his approach is pretty good because similar to mine, he kind of like pre-made this movie in his head and then executed it rather than doing it like a verite style. So there's pros and cons to both methods, but I tried the verite style of Memory Video before we went to McGill. Then when we went to McGill, I went with a more scripted kind of condensed route. So I thought that applied pretty well to the guy too. And also EJ has been a great help. The Memory Video is my first real project, so being able to talk to EJ, asking advice about how to release it online and how to go about the distribution and everything has been pretty helpful. So
excellent.
And I know you had set up a call with us after you first started speaking with him, and yeah, I mean, he was just very helpful, was not shy about trying to help you get Memory Video in all the right places, and it is something about this community above and beyond the work that does help other people do better and share great stories.
All right, so we're going to saddle up and head into EJ McLeavey-Fisher.
It's the Video Jungle Podcast. Find your fascinating.
I think it's no secret that like agencies and stuff scour the Vimeo world for projects that are kind of similar to whatever they might be drafting up for a client.
Today we're speaking with E.J. McLeavey-Fisher, a documentary filmmaker whose work has garnered several Vimeo staff picks and film festival selections, including AFI, Nantucket, Montclair, and Big Sky. E.J. just finished a successful run with his latest short, The Guy, all about the life of Hollywood stuntman Brian Donahue. E.J., welcome to the Video Jungle podcast.
Thank you.
It was interesting because we were doing our short films and, we started scouting and I watched The Guy. And I remember watching and going, man, this is really intriguing. And then I realized he was somewhat local to our area, which makes it even cooler. But really briefly, tell me how you stumbled upon Brian and how you stumbled upon the idea that he would be a good story.
Yeah, sure. So I direct a lot of commercials as well, in addition to my documentary work. And I was casting for, it was for Aetna Health Insurance. And the concept for this commercial was they wanted to interview real life stunt people and then put them through this sort of obstacle course. So in this day of casting, I was, interviewing dozens of stunt people, and Brian came in and basically gave me his 30-year long resume of what he's done. So, football, wrestling, stunt stuff. He's done so much. And he also mentioned that he worked at UPS otherwise. So I was just blown away by this guy. And his his personality came right through in that audition. Some of the stunt people, part of the reason they only do stunts is because they're not necessarily great actors. But Brian obviously had a charm to him that was unique. Of course, I didn't end up casting him for the commercial. It's just he wasn't the right guy for that. But I emailed him, I think that night, and I was like, hey man, we need to talk more about your story because I really think there's something there. I'm not casting you for this commercial, but whatever. And yeah, we got on a call, I think the next day, and he just talked for 2 hours, and I was just my hand hurt from typing notes as we went along. And at the end of that, I wrapped my head around it, and I'm like, cool, I think we should shoot something if you're down for it. And he was.
So, EJ, I think what you just described is both one of the major pros of being in this industry and a potential con, right? You're taking your time to invest in something because you got hooked. What was it about Brian that got you hooked? And then where did it go from there once you said, okay, let's actually shoot something? Did you say in your head, we're going to really commit? Or what was the first step? So what was it about Brian's personality that got you hooked? And then, okay, you go and film something, and where does it go from there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing with Brian, obviously, on paper, he has a good story. There's no question about that. But beyond that, he's just such a good storyteller. His the most sort of mundane day-to-day stories from his job at UPS are just as entertaining as when he's working with these superstar actors. And I think that over a few years or however long I've been making these short documentary films, I realized that the storytelling element is from the subject is just as, if not more important than what the actual story is. And so I was like, this guy can, he can talk for hours and everything he's saying is compelling. There aren't many people that can do that. And so, I knew there was something there. If anything, I sat down, I remember after we got off the call, and I'm like, there's too much to digest here. What even is this? Usually you kind of have a sense of what the story arc is and things like that, or at least I try to. And there I was I don't even know where to begin with this. So our plan was, let's just shoot basically a day of interviews, because I think it's going to be, he's going to be able to talk all day long. And I think we need to basically hear his full story that way and then figure out what the hell we're going to shoot around it. Is it going to be a verite kind of following him through his actual day-to-day life? Is it going to be sort of these reimagined versions of that, which is sort of what we ended up doing. And yeah, so I wanted to basically start with this interview just to get his story down, and then working with my editor who's a total wizard. I knew if I could just give him that to work with, he would come back to me, which he did a month later with this novel of sort of ideas and things that we could do.
Can you tell me a little bit about the interaction you have with Brian? So, for instance, when you do a story about somebody, Did he let you tell that story? Did he influence it? Were you sharing the dailies and the cuts and the versions with him, or what was the back and forth like? And how much control would you recommend anybody giving to a subject like that when you're trying to tell a story?
Yeah, I think I didn't show Brian any cuts until we were probably 90% done. I don't remember when I first showed it to him, but that's usually the way I'll go about that, is like I just know that I've built the trust with the subject to not, if they're asking me to see a cut early on, that's fine, and I'll say no because I'm not ready to share it with them. But if they're like worried about their image or how they're going to look, then that's kind of a red flag for me, because that's not the point. It's not like a marketing tool for them, or it can be later, but that's not the main point of it. So yeah, I think with all my projects, I usually don't show it until we're basically close to being locked. If throughout the project there'll be a question, I'll ask if there's something sensitive. Like there was a shot that we were using of someone in the guy where it sort of showed this. It showed like a sort of physical ailment that this person had that we weren't able to fully explain in the story. It wasn't Brian; it was like another person, and I showed it to Brian because it's like a friend of his, and I was like, are you comfortable with us using this? And he said no, like based on like the context of it, it's not okay. And like I showed him that, I think, well before I showed him an actual cut of the film. So stuff like that I'll show if it's like questions, but I think, you need to build that trust up front, and then you also need to just stay true to like who the person is. You can't, just because there's like a more interesting film version of this person's life doesn't mean you should go and make it that if it's not the right thing. So I guess I sort of trust my instincts in that way, where it's like I know whatever I'm going to show this person is fair to them, even if it's not the most glamorous portrayal of their life. I've never had anyone come back to me and be sort of unhappy.
And you do a lot of corporate work. You've worked with Pepsi and Kellogg's and Coke Zero, and like when you work with a client, sometimes it's like you got to use what you have. But when you're doing your own story, you get to choose, and the hard part is not using something and making that decision. When you did your days of interviews with, or should I say the day of interview with Brian, did you know like right away, like, yeah, this is going to work because of the way he was speaking? Did you see a story develop? But how long did it take you to kind of develop from that interview process through your editor? Did you really develop what you thought the story was going to be?
Yeah, it took a long time. I mean, we knew the basic bones of it. Like we knew what the story would be from like his past up until kind of present day. And the question was, how do we make a film that's about what he's doing now? And like, what is what's the struggle? I think the obvious drama to his story is like, it's really hard to do what he's trying to do. And he's getting older, and like he doesn't get the same looks as some of these younger guys. And like that, that's a familiar trajectory. So it's like within that construct, what is his story, And I think we went through a lot of different versions. I want to say, because my editor would send me rough cuts and they're all numbered, I think we ended up at like version 160 or something. We kept trying to figure out what is the hook and what it, not the hook, I shouldn't say that, but like, what are we following with Brian? Because we weren't able to like tag along to these shoots of his, because he's shooting like, Law and Order, all these like huge, like kind of corporate network shows and movies where you can't just like show up with your own camera and be like, cool, we're going to follow Brian around. We tried to do that. It didn't work. So we realized that wasn't the way this was going to happen, telling his story, which is like, that's sort of the instinct, is like, just follow the story and see what happens. So we really did have to sort of craft the narrative in a way. I think one thing that we definitely pushed Brian to, talk about more and investigate more is the sort of brain injuries that he has suffered over the years. That obviously becomes a part of the story and is somewhat of a turning point. Not to spoil it for people who haven't seen it, but it's something that he brushes off in his everyday life, and brushes off in the film to some degree. And we were like, we need to know more about this. Like like we're genuinely concerned about him. His wife is concerned about this. Lori, who's like one of the main characters, obviously. And so we kind of pushed to explore that more, and that was interesting because it wasn't like he didn't necessarily have more appointments set up for this, but we were like, hey, we want to learn more about this. Are you willing to like meet with another doctor and things like that? So, that to me, those are still like some of the most powerful scenes, even though I know, and I'm not like shy about telling people that those were like reenactments that we shot later, that we weren't in there for the actual MRI, but I still think the way that, we cut to that and the music and everything kind of comes together, and it sort of like puts the story in a new place once you see him in that position, this like huge guy in this insane like stand-up MRI contraption.
It reminded me of Free Solo, right? Like the story of this famous rock climber that scales some of the biggest rocks out there.
Just in case you've never heard of it.
With no cables and whatnot, right? Like they forced into the narrative, hey, let's have you meet with a psychologist to like see what's going on, or have MRI done to see what's like chemically happening in your brain, because how are you not completely terrified of this? And he didn't want to be the one getting this, but like the documentarians wanted to like figure out what was going on.
Yeah, because those guys, they care about the work that they are passionate about, and whether or not deep down they are terrified of these things, that's not the image that they're portraying, right? Or that they're trying to put out there. So I think that was like a really valuable lesson that I learned in this film is like, as a director of a documentary, you are able to really explore these themes, even if you're not being guided there by the subject, and that's not inauthentic. That's not wrong. I mean, it needs to be it's a part of their life, and it's a part that people as an audience want to see, and I think, the Free Solo thing's a good comparison, because he's obviously like doesn't give a shit about that stuff. He doesn't care about really anything except climbing. Right. So, I think that's a good comparison. And I think, but like, if that's all that mattered, there wouldn't be a movie about this. You could just watch like YouTube videos of him climbing. Like that's the difference between that and a film, I think.
Well, the other thing, I did some research on the guy when I first saw it on Vimeo, and I like to read or look behind the scene type of thing. There was an article that I read, and correct me if I'm wrong or if this changed, but I remember reading somewhere where you said you always had worked with like a smaller team, maybe like 2 or 3 people, you as the director or DP. And then for this particular one, and I think you mentioned it earlier in this podcast, you had some large crews trying to capture some of the scenes you wanted. Did you learn a lot from that? Is there an advantage? Do you like working the larger crews, the smaller crews? Like, what's your recommendation for people out there doing shorts, and what do you prefer to do?
Yeah, it all depends on what you're shooting. I mean, I think the big crew for some of those scenes was great. Like we had a Movi, we had an AD and a second AD wrangling all of our like dozen stunt people we had that day. So it was necessary then, but there were definitely scenes in other places, like for example, the interview with or the conversation with the neurologist, where it was like 2 of us. I wouldn't want more than that in there. I think you need to kind of respect whatever the scene is that you're going for, and what's going to make that the best version of itself. I run into that with commercials a lot too. Is like, most of the commercials I shoot are sort of like real person documentary based things, and as you guys know, like the budgets vary wildly on these. So sometimes there'll be no money, and sometimes there'll be. I've done versions of this that are like, we have like a 70-person crew. It's like huge, like basically like normal like film crew on this thing, and it just depends what you're going for. I think I would always rather keep things as small as possible, just because you tend to move around faster, and you can kind of discover things that might be obscured by having so much other distraction on set. But I think it really does come down to what you need, and I've been doing it long enough where I know I can be pretty efficient with the crew, and like oftentimes if we're bidding on a commercial, that my head of production will send me the bid, and I'll look at it and I'll be like, let's get rid of this person, that person, just because I know we don't need them. And that just comes from doing it long enough, or knowing the DP that you're working with and knowing that they aren't going to need these people. They'd rather not have them. So Yeah, I guess it's just a case by case thing. I don't think bigger is definitely not better. I'll say that. I was talking to someone the other day who's like starting to get into film, and they wanted to pick my brain about how to use a camera that they bought. And I was asking them what they wanted to film. They wanted to do, these like YouTube sort of talking head instructional videos. And I was like, don't worry about using that camera yet. It sounds like it's way more complicated than it needs to be. Like, just whatever you're going to shoot, just start shooting it on your phone to learn the mechanics, And I think just do it. Like, I've actually been looking, I bought a bunch of like, little lenses and things for my iPhone because I've been trying to find a story that I can shoot on my phone. Like, I think that would be a fun challenge. And I think there's a time and a place for that. Obviously, we've seen that with a bunch of like proper films that have come out in the past few years. So I think it's just all about what the story is.
Hey, Justin.
Yeah.
Question: can anybody find their fascinating?
100% of people can find their fascinating. Yes.
Is that a scientific fact?
The studies are in. We conducted a lot of research, spent way too much money determining that find your fascinating is a thing that humans can do.
And how many dentists approve of our find your fascinating?
4 out of 6.
And what are the other 2 doing right now?
They're
basically not dentists anymore, Justin.
Right.
So they don't
didn't
count.
know.
So
I didn't
really
know what
4
happened
out of
to
4
them.
dentists because they didn't understand the process, so they just didn't make it in this world. So if you want to make it in this world of creativity and finding your creative courage, you should go to findyourfascinating.com right now. We'll send Justin right into your office. We'll send our team into your office, and we will find your fascinating.
But not if you're a dentist.
But not if you're one of those other 2 dentists. They lost their chance.
So one thing that I'm curious about, what Artie was just hitting on, is we're encouraging our team to, search for stories and just do the fundamental first step, which for us really is about like interviewing somebody, especially obviously in the documentary side of things. How many of those sort of stokes do you have in the fire at any given time where you're saying, okay, this could be an interesting story, or this could be one. I've interviewed this person. How many of those do you have going on? And what's sort of your litmus test for this one is good enough? Because you have a handful of videos that have been pretty successful through the years, in addition to obviously all of your corporate work. What is your process for finding the story and then testing it enough to say, yeah, this one works, this one doesn't, and how many don't end up working out?
Yeah, I've tried to streamline that a bit. I feel like over the years, I pretty much always have like 2 or 3 things going at a given time outside of like commercials, and those are kind of constantly happening. So I'm trying to work on the personal projects sort of when I'm not working on that stuff. So right now I have 2 shorts that I'm working on that I'm shooting, and it's same thing where we sort of shot an initial day or 2, and I'm working with editors to sort of develop the main story before I go back and shoot more. I've realized that that's definitely the workflow that I like. I also I can't really focus on stories that are like pure like follow doc verite things anymore. I used to do a bit more of that, and now I have 2 kids at home, and it's just hard I can't just pack up and leave and do that like I'd like to. That being said, I just went out to Portland in January for what I thought was going to be maybe my first feature doc about a musician who actually lives in Iowa, but he was out in Portland for some shows. And, I spent a bunch of money, flew some crew out there, shot for like 3 or 4 days with this guy who's amazing. But I got home and was wrapping my head around what we shot, and I'm like, I just can't commit the time to this. Like, I thought it was going to be a project where I could go visit him like once a month for a few months leading up to this his band's like reunion show in Spain. And I just realized it was the type of thing to do it right would require someone to like be there all the time living with this guy. And 15 years ago, that might've been something I could have done, but it just wasn't in the cards. So I felt bad because it's like, to spend this time with someone and then have to like write them or call them and be like, hey, I just can't do this movie that I want to do with you. It felt really bad, but it wasn't like the story wasn't compelling. It was just logistically impossible. So Yeah, I think I've become like way more ruthless with that. Whereas I used to like, I would have formerly like let that project kind of like sit around for a while and maybe I'd get to it. I just don't do that anymore. It's like I'm either going to do something or I'm not. And so yeah, I'd say like a handful of shorts are always sort of bubbling around, and then I'm always looking for like what can be the longer form project or feature or series or something. But those I'm like extra careful about.
If you were to give people advice, or have you figured out what your tipping point is? I mean, you spent a bunch of money to go follow this musician, came back, and obviously you feel the emotional ties to somebody when you interview them and you're trying to tell their story, but you're also trying to like balance like how you're going to pay for this stuff. I mean, that's when you're working in the corporate world, you have the corporate strings to tie a project together. When you're doing this on your own, have you figured that part out? Have you figured out like what your tipping point is and how far you go with an interview day or how far you go with a production day?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that I've recognized as a pattern in like whenever I've released a short doc is that I book a bunch of commercial work after that. So it's sort of, I like invest the money up front, and as long as the thing isn't bad and no one watches, like as long as it gets some buzz, it usually books me a couple commercials, which, make up for whatever money I'm spending on the project. So I'm always able to justify it that way, but there's obviously a limit to like how much you want to spend. This music doc I was going to need to do a Kickstarter, which I've never done before, but it was going to be, a ton of travel money that we needed. So, I was going to need to get some assistance with that. But, overall, I think, yeah, I'm fortunate in that the work that pays the bills, these commercials, is pretty similar stylistically to my personal work. Like you look at The Guy, for example, that was like, we made a very conscious effort to like elevate the production value on that compared to like the other doc work I've done. And that translates directly into like a commercial that looks pretty similar to it, And I think there's definitely I'll continue investing more and more money on a project if I know it's going to be worth it. So like for The Guy, we did one big interview day where we had to, hire some crew and put a bit more production into it. And then for most of the next like couple of years, it was basically me and my DP, sometimes an AC, and we were not spending much money. But as things ramped up and we realized it was going to be, we thought it was going to be pretty good. There were some days where we had like that, the last day we shot basically, we had like 10 other stunt people and we had a bunch of locations and we had like a 10-person crew for that, which is, that's coming out of my pocket. But I knew at that point, like, this is the thing we need to put it all together and it's totally going to be worth it. And, in the end it was.
So I think what's really interesting in this industry is that there's so many ways you could market yourself, right? Like, and choose to spend your money. You can choose to spend your money on gear and all that type of stuff, but you can also choose to spend your money on marketing yourself. And you could have a website, you could have a podcast, you could be at events, you can do all that type of stuff. You choose to use these passion projects as the way you market yourself. And I think what's really nice is what you just hit on, this idea that if I put work out that is representative of me and the type of work I want to be doing, and I am the creative director, everything goes through me, I'm very likely to kind of like magnetically attract the type of work that I actually want to be doing, and people see it and say, hey, that's the work I could do. Why is that valuable to your clients? Because they end up seeing kind of you, not just corporate you working on corporate stuff, but they see, okay, EJ is into like this type of stuff, and this is his way of storytelling, and this isn't something that he made for Pepsi or a big company. This is something he actually made for himself.
Yeah, no, I think over the years I've come to realize that like, agencies and whoever's hiring you for a paid project, they want to work with like a director. They don't want to work with a commercial director only, And I think if you look at like my website, you'll see, I put my short film work is like the first thing you see up there, and then followed by a bunch of commercials that sort of like proves that I've done commercials and know how to do them. But like, no matter how good those things are, no matter how much I like those spots, like they're still 30 seconds long or a minute long, and you can only show so much of yourself. Even if you have like free reign to do whatever you want, it's still just the sort of the structure of it it's not the same. You can only get your voice out so much. So I think, for me, and I think for a lot of people, it's just the best reflection of your style when there are still limitations, of course. There's like resource limitations and all sorts of things, but creatively, you essentially have a blank slate to make whatever you want. And I think, that's what people want. They want to hire a director who has a voice, and you can see that voice more clearly in your personal work, I guess, is the crux of that, and whenever I'm working on a commercial project and I'm, going out to dinner with the people I'm working with on it, we're usually not talking about the other commercials I've done. We're only talking about the shorts I've worked on. I think it's great to be able to kind of float back and forth between those things, but it definitely, my personal work is the best reflection of my style.
I think with anything that's creative, like you put your heart and soul into it, 3 years later, it's hard to come to a close, but you say, okay, I'm going to do a final lockdown of this movie, and you show it to Brian. Brian's a big dude, obviously tough guy, stuntman's worked in the industry for a long time. What was his reaction? Was like, are you nervous when you show it to him, or were you expecting anything from it? And what was when it ended? What was the reaction from Brian?
That's a good question. I mean, I know he really loved it. He told me, I think I sent it to him, on some weekday evening, and the next day I don't remember if he called me or he texted and said he'd watched it 20 times. Like he and Lori, his wife, really loved it. And yeah, I think he's probably seen it more than anybody at this point. He's gone to every festival and really enjoys it because it is. I like to think because it is a true reflection of him, and it in a lot of ways it's like a movie about him. That was a sort of guiding principle, is we're not just making a doc. We want what is the movie about Brian's life that Brian would want to make,
And obviously Quentin Tarantino's film, Brad Pitt's character in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is totally based on the guy. Yeah. It's a well-known fact.
Yeah. I licensed the story to them.
Tarantino appreciates it.
Hey, you know what? Before we leave, this is your time to promote yourself. Tell people where they can find your work, your website, what's coming up next, things that we could be keeping our eyes open for EJ.
Cool, yeah. So you can see my work at ej-mf.com. And that's where you can see all my shorts and some of my commercial work. I'm repped for commercials by Greenpoint Pictures in Brooklyn. And you can see some other work there. Right now, like I said, I'm working on a couple shorts. New Jersey-based things, which is where I live now. So I'm trying to keep it local, and then have a couple other things brewing. So I guess nothing too specific that's exciting to mention yet, but always cranking on something.
Well, I, for one, think you're doing fairly well for yourself, EJ, so congratulations. I really enjoy your work. I really enjoyed The Guy. As Justin said, congratulations on that being turned into Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Well, get on Quentin Tarantino's case to get your royalties. But congratulations. Really appreciate you being on the podcast. And hopefully someday in the future, we can collaborate at some point. That would be great.
That sounds awesome. Thank you guys so much.
Justin, one of the things that I really loved about EJ's approach is something we try to implement here. Really just doing the interview first, figuring out if the subject is a good person to do a story on, and if they can tell the story in a way that's going to be fascinating.
Yeah, I think we've tried doing things a lot of different ways, and when we're trying to plant a lot of seeds, we want everyone on our team actively trying to work on a passion project. But it is really hard if your starting place is to fully map out the style of everything sometimes until you find the right character. I think we saw it with Memory Video. We had enough of a plan, but you need to sit down, spend a couple hours with somebody, interview them, get to know them to help weed out, should I invest any more time in this? And what is the tone of this story? What is the tone of this character? What are they bringing to this story that's something that I would have never thought of? And how should I adjust my plan based on that?
And it's definitely conflicting. And Roy, you can attest to this because you edit a lot of our talking heads on the corporate side. When you're doing, now that you've had the Memory Video experience, you know that Miguel was the right person. But now you're doing the corporate side. Not everybody works, but corporate wants you to use everybody because they took their time to interview. It can get a little daunting and almost frustrating when you're trying to force in something is not going to work, correct?
Right. You need to be very selective with the kind of what you decide to show and use, even when it comes to whole people, right? So, I mean, with memory video, for example, and with the guy, we were only focused on one person, one major speaking role. And the guy goes a little bit further into letting other people speak and everything, but it's tough. It's tough to cut people out when they might be good, but just don't suit the story well.
Yeah, I've kind of come to this conclusion, Justin, that on the corporate side too, it's almost better to have like one of those large media days where you interview a lot of people and then kind of whittle it down to the ones that are going to work. So when you make the next production for them, you know exactly who's going to work, and just nail the 12 interviews that are going to really be successful, because I think the lesson that we're learning from the passion side actually does translate over to our corporate side in telling great stories.
Sure. I mean, the benefit that we have with a lot of corporate settings is if we go in and interview 40 people on somebody's team, not only do we know those 40 people, but we hear a lot of stories and we can point to the one or two people that are worth saying, hey, there's no doubt that telling your brand story authentically can happen through your people. And of the 40 people that we talk to, let's do a bigger story on these two people, because they are going to magnetically attract, either from a recruiting standpoint or from a sales standpoint. They're going to help you actually tell your story to the bigger world. And you can then take the same approach that you take for memory video or the guy for telling their stories. Now, it's not going to be in a film festival, or maybe it would be.
Maybe.
But there's no reason that you can't take a very similar approach and have like a similar mindset around how you produce the story.
It's almost like we're creating our own like Survivor reality show where they
Exactly.
start with 40, get down to 12, and then you are the last two. Let's make this happen. The other thing I found really intriguing talking to EJ is betting on yourself. I mean, I don't want to guesstimate how much finances EJ put into some of his stuff, but he goes for it, right? He says, this is a story I think is worth pursuing. I'm going to go do that. And I think that's pretty intriguing. That's why, Roy, you're on your own next time. Make it happen.
Yep, I'm already starting the Trash TV fund, so I'm going to get $500 all by myself to put into it. I'm going to get one costume.
Blammo, that should get us Matthew McConaughey.
Yes. And Roy, in your conversations with EJ, did you learn anything, pick things up that I'm sure every time you run across a producer or director at these film festivals, what was it about EJ and any lessons learned from him?
I think the best thing is just affirmation about the approach that I did with memory video, because I felt a little self-conscious with my heroes being like Herzog for like documentaries where, you know, it needs to be verite, it needs to be organic, but seeing something like The Guy, which I think is so good, and kind of hearing that he did a pretty similar approach with memory video kind of made me feel better about having kind of a scripted documentary in mind.
Leaning into that, Justin, I mean, betting on yourself and really going for it. I mean, the outcome for EJ is he truly believes that if he does his best work on the passion side, it's going to lead to his next job, his next gig, his next client.
I mean, he doesn't just believe it, he's made it happen, right?
Yeah.
Like, his passion projects get hundreds of thousands of views, and they are very reflective of where he is and thinking about himself and his brand as he continues to grow and develop, and then that just attracts the right type of work. So if you have time, check out EJ stuff, check out other similar documentaries. Don't be shy about that type of content, because whether you're interested in the film festival world or producing just organic human stories, or if you're interested in scripted films, or if you're a marketer, all of this stuff is relevant, because the new way of marketing is to tell stories that translate beyond a brand. So I think things like The Guy, it's a 20-minute story, it's long, but it's an intriguing story that someone would actually watch.
This has been the Video Jungle Podcast. Find your fascinating, a product of Animus Studios